Here to give you the latest on the Iran war and to also take a closer look to the best of our abilities given the closed environment in Iran, the information environment in Iran, at what people may be experiencing or thinking there at the moment. We'll be speaking to correspondents and special guests from across the region.
Yeah, Jerusalem, London, Istanbul, all places will be taking the conversation this hour, with Iran clearly at the centre of the discussion. Now, Melissa and I have questions for our journalist and our guests, but the way this works best is when you get involved. Melissa is driving things, but via me, whether you're watching on YouTube or whether you're watching on TikTok, please hit me up with your questions and comments and I'll let you get on with things.
Now, a quick recap of where things stand. As the war nears the end of its first week, Israel and the United States say they are ramping up their attacks on Iran. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says firepower over Iran is about to, quote, surge dramatically, while Israel's military says its operation is entering a new phase. Now, here is the Israeli military's chief of staff speaking.
After completing the surprise strike phase in which we established air superiority and suppressed the ballistic missile array, we are now moving to the next phase of the operation. In it, we will further increase the blow to the foundations of the regime and its military capabilities. In our hands are additional surprising moves that I have no intention of revealing. We will pursue our enemies, all of them, and we will reach them.
Israel has also intensified its attacks on Lebanon. It's ordered mass evacuations across Beirut's southern suburbs as it continues to bombard what it says are targets linked to Iran-backed Hezbollah. Plus, Iran's still firing back at Gulf cities and on Israel. Neither Iran nor the United States nor Israel show any signs of wanting to end the fighting at this stage. So we're going to start first in Lebanon. We are glad to have Makram Rabah. He is an assistant professor of history at the American University of Beirut, where his research interests include the Lebanese civil war. Welcome, Makram.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, the southern suburbs of Beirut have been hit. What's happened overnight and this morning there? What are you feeling, hearing, seeing?
Well, in a blink of an eye, we are now facing a kind of a humanitarian crisis because the southern suburbs of Beirut has over 500,000 people who were displaced overnight. So if you are to go in the streets of Beirut, you will find people who are sleeping on the in public squares. You have people sleeping in their cars, and one has to remind everyone that this is the holy month of Ramadan. So these people are living under terrible conditions, and they did not have the time even to take their personal belongings with them. And unfortunately, what's happening will not end anytime soon, and Lebanese authorities or Lebanese state has no real emergency plan other than opening the public schools, which will now become a kind of temporary housing for these refugees.
Speaking of people leaving the areas, there are many Lebanese trying to flee. How difficult has it been for them to leave, and where are they heading? And Makram, while you answer that question, I'm going to pull up a map that we have showing where people are trying to get to, evacuation routes. But definitely tell us what you're hearing from people.
Well, to put things into perspective, when we talk about the southern suburbs, we're talking about a very short distance from where the bombs are falling and the capital, Beirut, because it's maybe a 5-minute drive from the area of operations to downtown Beirut, where most of the people fled. Most of the people are trying to flee to areas which are not distinguished by the Israeli Defense Force as theaters of operation. However, at the end of the day, no one knows if you are living right next door to a Hezbollah operative, because just recently, over the last hour, there was a hit on a civilian building in the city of Saida, south of the capital, Beirut. So in a way, wherever people are fleeing, you don't know if death or the Grim Reaper will be pursuing you, because at the end of the day, while the Israelis are trying to run a controlled war at the end of the day doesn't really save civilians, be it the continuing humanitarian crisis or the ongoing bombing. People were led to believe that the southern suburbs of Beirut will be razed to the ground, and this is still an open scenario, so to speak.
You're talking about people concerned about the area being razed to the ground. I actually want to run a soundbite from Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Let's have a listen. And Makram, I want you to respond and react to the soundbite. Stand by.
We are now on the northern border after the IDF instructed all residents of the area to evacuate. You wanted to bring hell upon us, you brought it upon yourselves. The Dahia will look like Khan Yunis. Our northern residents will live in quiet, peace and security.
It sounds as if at least some members of Israel want the area to look like Gaza, a complete wasteland. Makram?
Well, I don't think that Smotrich is the person that is calling the shots. The Israeli army is a professional army. It does use lethal force, and it's very brutal when it carries out its violence. However, it doesn't do politics. What Smotrich is trying to do is to draw parallels between Gaza and Beirut is not totally true, simply because there's no resistance coming out of these areas, particularly the southern suburbs of Beirut. And even if we are to indulge Smotrich in this hallucination of his, the raising of Khan Yunis did not give security to the people of Israel. We still have elements within Hamas still causing trouble. And the whole idea is that we are hoping as Lebanese that ultimately this war will end not by more blood, but rather with the Lebanese state courageously endorsing and promoting a viable peace with Israel, a peace that would take into consideration the lives of the Lebanese first and foremost.
Makram, Anthony Howard here alongside Melissa here in the studio. You did refer to 500,000 people. I want to check that figure with you that have been displaced, at least that many. In relation to that, how explicit has the Israeli military been with their warning to residents in terms of announcing bombardments? Are they telling residents to clear specific buildings? And if so, how much lead time are people getting in these areas? Minutes or hours?
Well, there's a number of different variations. If the Israelis want to assassinate a high-ranking Hezbollah member, it does not telegraph what it's doing. It actually goes after him. Usually what happens is that these operations are fairly limited and the explosives that are used are minimal compared to bringing a whole building to the ground. However, the IDF, through its spokesperson, when they warn about buildings, they actually give you an exact geographical distance that you should keep. So they tell you have to be 300 meters away. However, yesterday it gave a kind of a blanket evacuation warning, which included the whole area. The southern suburbs of Beirut geographically might be small, but it is very dense when it comes to population. So overnight it created half a million of displaced people, in addition to the people of the south of the Litani who were also instructed to clear their homes and their villages overnight. So all of a sudden, despite the surgical operations the IDF is carrying out, the repercussions or the fallouts are no different from any sort of war.
Makram, I want to check in with Anthony and ask, what are you seeing in chat? Are people making comments or questions, or it's a pretty quiet group for now?
It's a quietish group for now. TikTok is just springing to life. A lot of people joining the conversation as we speak. And questions about residents and what the conditions are for residents who have to leave their homes, Makram, which you've just addressed. I'll come back to you shortly.
Great. Makram, I want to talk about Hezbollah. It has been severely weakened over the past 18 months. Can they withstand these bombardments?
Well, if you are to engage in Hezbollah's logic says that if the whole globe is destroyed, but they still have one person which is shouting for Iran or for Hezbollah, they declare a kind of divine victory. And this is why it is very dangerous, because simply everyone was hoping and betting on a kind of a patriotic stand, that everyone is watching what's happening in the Gulf and what's happening in Iran, especially that now that Hezbollah is not only fighting Israel, but rather is fighting the American military. So everyone was betting that they would stay away from the fight, but all of a sudden they decided to jump in. Because at the end of the day, however you look at it, Hezbollah is the Revolutionary Guard's Lebanon operation. And that's why ultimately, whatever happens, if we do not debunk the narrative of Hezbollah, which they claim that their weapons and their existence is to protect the people of Lebanon, and more importantly, the Shiites of Lebanon, we will never be able to defeat Hezbollah. It's not about disarming them physically, but rather neutralizing them as an idea, something which the Lebanese political elite have failed to do so up until now.
And meanwhile, the video that you're seeing is the skyline of Beirut. Makram, we haven't really talked about the Lebanese government. Have they said anything? Can they really do anything?
Well, I think it's too little too late. Over the last 2 days, they did something really good, but they have failed to follow through. The Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and the government of Lebanon has declared the military wing of Hezbollah illegal. However, I don't see any difference between the military wing and the political wing, because however you look at it, they serve each other. And rather than following up and making sure to do practical steps to distance Lebanon from the ongoing fight, by, for example, issuing arrest warrants for people who are publicly endorsing engaging in military action, I think that Lebanon, as a state and as people, will continue to pay the price for Iran's suicidal adventure in the area.
Makram, we do have, I think, Anthony, are you seeing anything?
I've just got one come specifically for Makram. And Makram, you're talking about the cost of this, of 500,000 people going onto the streets. There's one here. How are these financial burdens that are now going to be facing Lebanon, how are they shared? Are they shared among other states?
Well, as you know, that Lebanon has went through a terrible financial collapse. So it's adding more burden on the treasury as a whole and as the taxpayers as a whole. But that's not important, because if we do pivot towards peace, and as you know, we have over 5-6 million Lebanese in the diaspora, money will trickle in. But if there's no peace and stability after the cessation of hostilities, no amount of money could fix things. So it is a terrible condition. And more importantly, the Lebanese need to realize that the Gulf states cannot come to our aid right now, because they are also under attack, and where they might not need aid and reconstruction in the same sense as we do, they will have different priorities than coming to the aid of the Lebanese. So I think one of the most important things after the end of the war is for structural reforms that would stop corruption and enable elements like Hezbollah to take over politically and to become normalized.
Makram, I'm going to check with Anthony. Anthony, any more comments or questions?
Nothing as yet.
All right, then. Makram Rabah, thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe. We're really grateful for your time.
All right, we're going to move on. And Tania Krämer is our correspondent in Jerusalem. We're expecting to speak to her shortly live. Tania, we do have some questions coming in. I'm not going to ask you directly just yet, hoping people in TikTok, hoping you'll address how Israel justified these strikes on Lebanon. So keep that in the back of your mind as we move on here. Our timelines are full of video of missiles and drones incoming to Israel. It is hard to decipher one day from the next at times. What has the last 24 hours been like there?
Well, I mean, there have been several alarms and air raid sirens going off last night as well, also during the night in some areas. So people had to scramble to shelters again, but they have been less frequent and also less long, the time that you have to spend in a shelter compared to the early days of this war. And obviously people are also following now the two theaters of war, that is Iran and what's happening in Lebanon and northern Israel. Basically, we've been already hearing the Israeli military, the chief of staff has said, this is moving into a sort of second phase. He said that 80%, or claiming that 80% of the air defenses in Iran were taken out, and 60% of the missile launches in Iran, meaning that's what they have been telling journalists here, that they were focusing specifically on those launches in that case. Now, on another front, obviously, we've been hearing the Israeli military again also this morning ordering people in Lebanon to leave certain areas. We had this, you talked about that in the southern suburbs of Beirut, now again in the Bekaa Valley, and also in South Lebanon. And on another front here, the home front in Israel, Israel has actually now dropped some of the restrictions from the early days. So people are allowed to go back to workplaces if there are shelters, but schools have not reopened as of yet. Now also it's the weekend. And also there are some repatriation flights of Israelis that are stuck abroad, so meaning that the airport is gradually opening, but that is really very, very limited. And we've heard of some planes that had to turn around before they could land.
Tania, as you've been talking, we've been looking at pictures of the Beirut skyline. I will take now that question from TikTok, asking about the Israeli justification for these attacks that are taking place.
So if we're talking about Lebanon right now, basically what Israel is saying that Hezbollah has never fully adhered to the ceasefire agreement from 2024. They say it is still south of the Litani River, and it has not fully disarmed. Now, what we have been seeing in the months leading up now to this war is that Israel has also basically continued to strike Lebanon. It had always, as part of this, some of its troops still stationed within the Lebanese border on the other side. Israel has said this is, to reinforce the border. And what is being discussed right now and what we've seen in the past days is that obviously this has been massively expanded with, ordering people in southern Lebanon to leave the area, for example, and people who might have just come back and moved back to this area. And basically, Israel is now striking in all of Lebanon and is striking Hezbollah.
One question coming through is Melissa, a viewer wanting to ask about Turkey. We are literally going to be going to Istanbul shortly. We'll put a pin in that for now and continue with Tania. Moving on more to the Iranian leg of things now, and after days of sustained Iranian counterstrikes, how much faith have Israelis got in the Iron Dome at this point and all other methods of air defence and all those layers? Do they feel relatively safe, Tania, or is there a level of anxiety about the stockpiles of interceptor missiles, and how much longer do they think the IDF can keep defending their skies?
I think there's a mix of everything in here, and but I think most Israelis would have really confidence in Israel's air defense, and you've been seeing this as well. I mean, there have been these barrages of missiles launched from Iran, and so far, we have casualties. People have been killed, but the numbers have been relatively low. There have been injuries as well. But, you have also different layers of the system. So it starts with the alerts on the phone. So people, when there are missiles from Iran, they get an alert on their phone. They're asked to move to protected spaces. Obviously, I also have to add, not everybody here has a shelter or a protected space at home. We're seeing this, especially also in the occupied West Bank. There are no shelters. But people are alerted to this, and then there are air raid signs going off, so they have the chance, to go and take shelter somewhere. And then you have the different air defense layers, as you mentioned, the Iron Dome, that is more for the short midterm range, and then you have the arrow system, the David Sling, and not to forget as well that we have all the U.S. Military assets in the region, and they're cooperating, obviously, to intercept those missiles, as well as there has to be, to some extent, there was also always in the past some cooperation with other countries in the region. But of course, as they are also targeted, they have their own share. Now, when it comes to offensive and defensive stockpiles, obviously, the picture is very sketchy. We don't hear much about how much there actually is, and that is obviously a consideration here in any of such war. But, we have heard from U.S. officials, they're at least claiming that this is not an issue and that is not a problem.
Tania, there has been a lot of discussion off the back of that about how long this conflict might drag on for. Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth are preparing Americans for weeks into months now in the last few days. What are Israelis being told about how much longer life might be lived like this?
Well, I think Israelis are being told basically by the government, be patient, be strong, be resilient. This might take a while. They don't have really a timeline that has been given. I mean, we heard from US President Trump, he was talking about 4 to 5 weeks. I think that's something that, you know, people here would consider as well. I mean, we also have critics of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that he might want to drag on with this war for quite a while. But, you know, we simply don't know here. And there's also a bit of a speculation discussion here among Israelis. You know, maybe the US president might just lose interest as well. Maybe he will stop the war as he has done sort of during the last Iran war in June last year. So people are certainly wondering what is this timeline and, you know, how long this goes on, whereas, you know, most people have been setting into this kind of routine, and it's never really routine because, you know, these missiles that are launched here against Israel, towards Israel, they are dangerous and people know that. So it's not, you know, there's always this, and you asked me about that earlier, this anxiety as well that is there, and it's not really normal here, but you know, the country goes a bit into this kind of strange routine that there's a war going on, but still shops are beginning to open, and so it's somewhere in the middle there.
You lead me into public attitudes. You mentioned days ago, Tania, that despite the precarious state of daily life there is still broad support for this campaign to weaken Iran as this conflict gets bigger and regional and drags on longer. Do you detect that the public is still backing continued attacks on Iran?
Well, I mean, it's always hard a bit to generalize, but because, you know, there are also people who are not supporting this. But if you're looking at polls in recent days, there's one I could quote here from the Israel Democracy Institute, for example. They're saying that an overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis, that is over 90%, do support the operation in Iran, and they also want to see this a lower percentage that, you know, both the political and military goals are actually fulfilled at the end. The picture is a bit different for those Israeli-Palestinian citizens. The minority here, they are only supporting by around 26% of this operation. I mean, Iran has always been perceived as a real threat to this country, and Iranian leaders have said they want to annihilate Israel. So, you know, people here would say, you know, this should now that it has started, it also should go on. There's also, when you look on the political level, most of the opposition parties, except for a few, are also aligned with the government. But I also think, you know, the longer this goes on, and if there would be even more casualties, if the situation would change again, you know, people will start asking questions. Where is this going? What are the political goals? What will be achieved? And also, we haven't really seen also here, you know, the human toll of what's really going on in Iran. Should not forget there are also some, you know, relations here. There are many Persian or Iranian Jews living in Israel. So all of this together, you know, the longer this goes on, and also, you know, what will actually be achieved, these are big question marks as well here.
Question on YouTube I had as well. Is anyone there, Tania, willing to even consider the idea of IDF personnel in Iran? Is there support for these attacks on Iran to extend to the idea of the IDF marching into Iran? Is that in any way part of the conversation?
Well, I think what most people here would support is to continue, you know, the air campaign. That's what we are seeing. I think boots on the ground, Israeli boots on the ground in Iran is something that I'm not sure Israelis would really fathom at the moment. We don't know what the plans are with what Israel and the US are thinking about doing. But most certainly what's being discussed here is when it comes to the situation in Lebanon. And we heard, from the defense minister, from the military, that, also military analysts are thinking that there could be a larger ground invasion again, at least in southern Lebanon. And I think this is also something that most Israelis would most likely, or let's say a majority would most likely support, because they also say this threat that they perceive from Hezbollah should be dealt with once and for all.
Tania, rolling together a couple of thoughts from TikTok and from YouTube. What would success look like through an Israeli lens? On the American side, there seems to be confusion about what it is the Trump administration wants to achieve. Do Israelis have a clear picture of what it is their government and military are trying to achieve? And if so, what exactly is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good question. And I think it's much more clearer on the military side of things than on the political side of things. I mean, the military is very much, saying, they want to eliminate the threat of the ballistic missiles. Hence, they are talking about, targeting, for example, the launches more and the infrastructure and everything that is related to that. Also, when it comes to the nuclear program, and obviously to take out the defense systems in Iran to get superiority, of the airspace together with the United States. Now, when it comes to the political goals, obviously, many commanders, starting with the supreme leader of Iran, were targeted and killed. But, while we heard the US President Trump saying really he wants to be involved in in choosing who's the next leader or who's ruling Iran, we've heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu all the time and repeatedly has said we want to create the conditions so the Iranian people will be able to take over. But, there are no details on that. We don't know how does that look like, who will do this, when will this be done, how this will work, and, these are the questions that everybody's asking, because that will be also then measured whether this operation or this war against Iran is actually a success.
Tania, lots of love for your reporting in our chat, and of course we very much appreciate your reporting as well, clearly under trying circumstances right now. Thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Anthony, I've been looking at chat along with you during this interview. I mean, just want to include this comment. We're not going to be talking too much about the Gulf region today, but Michael Schultz asking who thinks Disneyland or Disney will still build a park in Abu Dhabi. So there you go. And also a lot of people asking about the Iranian response. So this might be a good time to actually air comments from the Iranian foreign minister. This was an interview that he gave to the American network NBC News. Have a listen.
We are not asking for a ceasefire. And we don't see any reason why we should negotiate with the US when we negotiated with them twice, and every time they attacked us at the middle of negotiations. So there is no request for a ceasefire by us, and there is no request for the negotiation with the US from us. We have never sent any messages to them.
And so it doesn't sound as if anyone is going to back down, which means that this conflict will continue. We are going to pivot and bring in our guest, Azadeh Pourzand, a human rights researcher with a focus on Iran. Azadeh, welcome. We really want to get a sense of what's happening in Iran, but of course there is an information vacuum in terms of what the world can try to find out. Do you have a sense from your contacts, the very few who might have managed to reach out to you via the, I understand, limited internet they have right now, about what the feeling is like on the ground?
Yes, thank you for having me. I have to put a disclaimer, though, from the beginning that the internet shutdown and the anxiety among the Iranian population really also cuts access even to people like me who would have otherwise been able to be in touch with more people. But from the limited interactions, indirectly or directly, that I've had, I think how I can describe it best is anxiety. I think that the individuals that have expressed how they feel these days to me is lack of sleep, sort of glued to whatever news they can get, trying to understand what's their immediate fate, in terms of both in terms of the scale of the attacks, but also the retaliation of the regime against the Iranian people, and also what the near future holds for them. Those that I have spoken with, while quite scared when it comes to, hearing the bombs, or I've even heard of individuals in parts of Iran whose home have been destroyed, or, for example, whose home has been attacked by the by the Iranian authorities, sort of questioning whether this regime will actually go under the current circumstances or not, and also the scale of the attacks by Israel and by the United States. So you're talking about the people who are trying, if they can afford it, sitting in their homes worriedly with lots of anxiety, watching what's happening to them, around them. And I would describe it sort of stuck in the middle of two wars, one at home with their own regime, one in the sky with basically the bombs that are being thrown.
Now, Azadeh, just now
by the US and Israel.
Yeah, Azadeh, just a few moments ago, the visuals that we were seeing was the skyline of Tehran. Now, you've really laid out a lot of the concerns of the Iranians that you've been able to speak to or text with, however you communicate with them. But before a couple of months ago, right, in January, there were protests, and that had largely been sparked, at least in the very beginning, over economic issues. Is that the main concern of Iranians now? Because I know that, of course, there's bombardment in Tehran and there are people leaving that city, but the vast majority of the country probably feels quite normal, unless you're in an area immediately near the bombardments.
The protests that basically that happened in January, and a few other protests in the previous years prior to that, were only triggered by economic grievances, but they were political in nature. And in particular, the last one, the Iranian people, I don't think they could have been louder than they were under the circumstances that they are in, which is absolute fear and mass-scale repression, and in the last round, mass killings, were loud and clear that they did not want this regime. So I just want to clarify that it was not purely economic, although economic situation has really put people in another level of despair that is probably very hard for us to understand sitting here. From what I understand from the testimonies that I have read coming from inside Iran, and from the little bit of bits and pieces I have gathered from those I know, is that as compared to the 12 days war, people who live in Tehran have not left Tehran as much as they did in the 12-day war. But at the same time, I've heard that some wish that they had left to places like the north of Iran, to the Caspian Sea. So life in Tehran is absolutely frightening at the moment, as I said, also because of the level of repression by the regime, but also because of the bombings of Israel and the US. People who can afford, they are sitting in their homes, but that's also it can last for so long, right? Like, you need food, you need access to certain things. So I don't think that the country in general is living in any way or form an ordinary, normal life. Again, don't forget, you're talking about two layers of struggle and war, and between those two, and added to that the economic circumstances, people who don't even have a way to make money right now, that I don't see any normalcy, with kids not being able to go to school, with people not being able to go to work, and just this constant anxiety and living in a vacuum of information in ways that I don't think any of the other countries in the region under attack by this and that are experiencing. The vacuum of information is truly, on top of everything else, frightening, and adds to this layer of lack of any level of normalcy or predictability.
Just a few more questions. I want to pursue that strand of talking about the protests, tens of thousands or thousands killed in January. And of course, you're referencing protests from the past, including the Women Life Freedom protests. What sense do you have from Iranians you speak to in terms of how willing they are to protest again? I mean, you've sort of painted this anxious picture, both economically and politically. How willing would people be to build an opposition to end the regime, given these current circumstances?
Yes, I mean, I am an Iranian living outside, but I honestly really cannot ever even understand the level of courage and despair and resilience of my fellow Iranians inside the country. So it's really hard to speak on their behalf in any shape or form. But what I can tell you from my perspective is I think the Iranian people's narrative is getting lost in the international or in the regional geopolitical narrative, which is probably, for me at least, is the saddest thing to see. Certainly none of us have even had time to process what happened in January 8th and 9th, in particular in Iran with the public massacres, but also in general. I think that it is a very surreal expectation to have of a nation that is being bombarded from the skies, but also essentially at war with the regime. But the regime is at war with them. To come out any of these days and sort of stage a protest, they may or they may not. But that's entirely up to them and to their decision, because that is risking their life from multiple angles. And also the Iranian head of the Islamic Republic head of the judiciary has very bluntly threatened the Iranian people. On their media, the Islamic Republic constantly is threatening the Iranian people. So between not having the safety in terms of the bombs and also a regime that is openly retaliating against its people, not just now, previously, but now probably in a much crazier scale, I think that we should not put the expectation or the pressure on the Iranian people to have to come out now to once again express what they demand or what their aspirations. I think they have said what their aspirations are, and at this point what matters is their safety and the fact that we guard those aspirations so that is not lost in the translation of this war that has sort of seems to have gone out of control.
Azadeh, last question. I want to delve a little bit into the complexity of Iran, because it's a lot of different ethnicities and a lot of people who want different outcomes. Some who continue to support the regime, some, and those who oppose the regime want different outcomes. Some want democracy, others might simply prefer a different core leadership. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the Iranian people?
Yes, Iran is quite a diverse nation, and what makes it even more special is that it had this diverse nation on their at least just the past 40-something years of repression has really stayed in solidarity as a nation. And when it comes to their dissent against the Islamic Republic, it was just a few years ago when woman life freedom was triggered with the death in custody of Jina Amini, a Kurdish young woman traveling into Iran. And we experienced it also in the diaspora. Like, it didn't matter you're Fars, you're Kurd, you're Baluch. We were all together at the same time crying and also demanding the same things: justice, accountability, an end to the culture of impunity, freedom. And so this is important to note that while diverse, the country, when it comes to human rights abuses, when it comes to aspirations for a better future, has really showed solidarity. But of course, when it comes to moments like this, the crises that you see, what I personally fear is that the external meddling will really damage the solidarity that we've seen when it comes to dissent among Iranians of different generations, and will add further pressure on the Iranian people, those of them at least who want a better future, in order to end up fighting with each other. Rather than staying focused on the ultimate goal, which is a dignified Iran for all Iranians, no matter what their ethnic, religious, or educational or socioeconomic background is.
Azadeh Pourzand, thank you very much for your time. We were really grateful.
Thank you.
We're going to go to Istanbul next, to our correspondent Julia Hahn. But let's take a moment to bring you up to date on some of the latest developments. And of course, continue to post your comments and questions. Anthony and I are both going to take a look at chat and see if we can bring in your comments and questions. Now, U.S. and Israeli forces are ramping up their attacks on Iran, with heavy strikes reported in the capital, Tehran. Israel's military warned the conflict was moving to the, quote, next phase, while the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said firepower was about to, quote, surge dramatically. Israel has stepped up its strikes on Lebanon in its campaign against Iran-backed Hezbollah. It has ordered mass evacuations of Beirut's southern suburbs, with tens of thousands of people forced to flee. Iran continues to launch attacks on Israel and Gulf states where U.S. assets are located. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have both intercepted strikes, and U.S. President Donald Trump said it would be a, quote, waste of time to send ground troops into Iran, but has insisted he would, quote, have to be involved in choosing Iran's next leader.
Shall I bring you up to date on a couple of comments and questions coming in?
Absolutely.
One from TikTok, from John. Why is there no more live pictures out of Tel Aviv? We didn't get to expressly ask that of Tania Krämer, but I do remember that in the past asking her the same thing. There are no more live pictures because it's about the security of emergency service personnel, and from the Israeli lens, also the safety of their military personnel should they be moving around in the area. They don't want to always give that information away. So that is regulated in Israel. What comes next after the bombs stop falling? We did put that to Tania as far as at least what were the Israeli goals, so hopefully that question has been answered for you. And the overarching theme I'm getting from a few places, including from Lex over and over in the chat, is that we don't want this war. Just a simple and elegant phrase that keeps on coming up. And one final one also from YouTube. Can reporters still use Starlink in Iran? We do know that early stages, one of the things that the Iranian security services did very effectively was to shut the internet down. That being when the protests kicked off onto the cost of living, they were able to severely restrict the use of the internet. And I believe that extends to Starlink as well, because those attempts were made in the early days.
There were some reports, though, that U.S. intelligence has been trying to smuggle Starlink systems into Iran, but we don't have a lot of detail about that. And, of course, there's a little confirmation.
And even an airdrop of Starlink at one point as well that was attempted, apparently. So if we get to know more, we'll let you know.
Absolutely. All right, let's bring in Julia Hahn, our DW correspondent in Istanbul. Thank you very much for your patience there. You know, our previous guest was talking about the ethnic diversity of Iran, and she mentioned, quote, external meddling, and I think she was obliquely referencing the fact that the American government appears to be actively discussing with the Kurdish population in Iran about arming them, or it appears as if they have in some cases. And I imagine that's not something Turkey wants to see. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, that's definitely not something Ankara wants to see, and Turkish officials are likely trying to persuade Washington not to go ahead with any such plans. Whatever these plans do entail at the moment, not a lot of information is out there about this. We've heard from the Turkish Defense Ministry saying Turkey is opposed to involving Iranian Kurdish dissident groups in the conflict, warning that it could further destabilize the region. Ankara considers the main Kurdish armed group in Iran, the PJAK or PJAK, as a terrorist organization with links to the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, that has waged a decades-long insurgency against the Turkish state. The PKK, by the way, is also on the US's terror list. This conflict has claimed tens of thousands of lives, and it has spread across the border into Iraq, into Syria. And Ankara right now is in the midst of very fragile peace efforts with the PKK, where the group basically said, we're ready to dissolve, to disarm. And I think now the concern is that any sort of further instability in Iran, potentially regime collapse, or any actions the US might be planning, it could sort of undermine these peace efforts with the PKK PKK, it could empower Kurdish militant groups, and it could revive Kurdish separatist aspirations. So for Turkey, this is an issue of national security. I think Ankara is very unlikely to accept any sort of, for example, Western arms transfers to Kurdish fighters in Iran, even though their actions would be limited to inside Iran. And I think this could also turn into a major point of tension between Ankara and its NATO ally, the US.
Yulia, specifically, has President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said anything about the Middle East conflict? And of course, it's clear they're worried about this conflict engulfing Turkey. A viewer had asked about Azerbaijan bordering Turkey because Azerbaijan accused Tehran of a drone attack and had threatened to retaliate. That's something that must concern Ankara as well. What has Erdogan said?
Yes, of course. Just if you look at the map of the region right now, you see that President Erdogan has plenty of reasons to be worried. Just if you look at where Iran has striked in retaliation to US-Israeli attacks. Just last night, he warned that the Middle East war had pushed tensions to what he called a terrifying level that could spread further. Now, Erdogan wants to stay out of this war. He does not want Turkey to be dragged into it, and that's why I think he has carefully calibrated his response to the conflict. So on the one hand, he has called US-Israeli attacks on Iran a violation of international law. Turkish officials have also said that Turkish airspace and territory would not be used for offensive operations against Iran. But on the other hand, Erdogan has also condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes as unacceptable, and he has called for de-escalation. I think Turkey knows that geography alone makes it very vulnerable to spillover. Turkey and Iran share a more than 500-kilometer border, so any instability across that border could lead to new refugee flows into Turkey. We've already talked about security concerns related to Kurdish militant groups. Energy disruption. Turkey buys natural gas from Iran, but also the oil price, the global oil price rising. This could really painfully hurt the already inflation-ridden Turkish economy. And then if you look at the security dimension, again, Turkey also hosts several strategic NATO military sites and an unspecified number of US troops. And we know that Tehran had always warned it would retaliate against US assets in the region should Washington strike Iran. And this is exactly what we're seeing play out. So there are concerns that Tehran might or could target Turkey more directly.
Speaking of NATO, I want to ask you about that. Earlier this week, a ballistic missile heading towards the country was shot down by NATO forces, and this was launched by Iran. And now NATO head Mark Rutte has said that it would not have triggered Article 5 if it had landed, the Article 5 being the mutual defense clause, that an attack on one member is an attack against all. Why do you think Rutte said that, and how is that being interpreted by Ankara?
Well, I think that just reflects how NATO interprets this incident. Article 5 is only triggered in the case of a direct armed attack on a NATO member state. And in this case, as you mentioned, the missile was intercepted and destroyed before impact. There were no casualties. So basically, NATO says the threshold hasn't been met. But what they did is say that they have strengthened their ballistic missile defense posture, whatever that means in concrete military terms. But I think this is sort of a signal of solidarity vis-a-vis Turkey, and also shows that NATO is taking this very seriously. But I think Ankara, too, has little interest in triggering Article 5 and potentially pulling the entire alliance into a direct conflict with Iran for all the reasons I've just talked you through. There are just so many risks involved here, and the Turkish government so far is really calling on everybody to calm down and trying to avoid being pulled into this war.
Yulia, last question for you, at least from me. I don't know if there's anything in chat or comments or questions, but...
Yulia's been doing a great job of answering these questions, specifically about refugees, so you take it away.
Absolutely. That is the question that I wanted to ask about, which is whether Turkey is concerned about refugees from Iran if this war continues into weeks and months.
Well, yes, definitely. As I said, Turkey and Iran have a very long land border, so Turkey is concerned about a possible refugee influx, especially if the conflict further escalates, if the regime collapses and the uncertainty grows. So far, Turkish officials say there is no sort of extraordinary movement along the land border or extraordinary numbers of people trying to seek safety in Turkey, and that sort of matches the reports we are hearing from the land border crossings. But of course, there are people coming in, and they have been telling fellow journalists that they are seeking safety, that the children are scared. Sometimes it's families coming. But you also have Iranians working and living on the Turkish side of the border who are now going back to Iran, saying they want to be with their families and they want to be in their country in this time of crisis. But the Turkish government is certainly making preparations, contingency plans that include setting up potentially a buffer zone along the border and also building temporary camps. The government said it could initially house up to 90,000 people if a sudden influx happens. But I should also mention that Turkey already hosts one of the largest refugee populations in the world, mostly from Syria and migration. For President Erdogan and his government, it's a very contentious political issue domestically, and needless to say that another refugee influx would put a lot of strain, additional strain on the Turkish economy, on social services here. So this is definitely a scenario Ankara is concerned about, but they're also preparing for it.
Julia Hahn, thank you very much for all this information. Grateful. All right, we're nearing the end of our live stream, but I actually want to bring in some additional information that was raised about the Starlink, because we have a team working behind the scenes trying to provide up-to-date information and anything that's raised by viewers. And so regarding
the question
Starlink,
was,
yes.
Can journalists in Iran use Starlink?
Yes, absolutely. Can citizens use Starlink? And it appears that the Iranian regime actively attempts to disrupt the service by electronic jamming and actually trying to figure out the locations of suspected terminals. So there are Starlinks there. We don't know how many. Top estimates suggest that there could be somewhere in the range of 40 to 50,000 users. And Starlink continues to provide its service to Iran despite calls from the regime to stop. And reports indicate that the service has been made free for users in Iran. So there you go. And this is how our live stream works. It's a little bit more informal than a news broadcast. We have the chat. We bring in your comments and questions so that you can pose them to our correspondents and our group of experts and special guests.
There were more questions coming through. I just want to point out there have been some great questions, and they were addressed by Julia along the way. So I didn't raise all of them, but fantastic questions coming through on both TikTok and YouTube.
So keep them coming for the future live streams. We're really grateful. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, I'm Melissa Chen.
And Anthony Howard. Right.
Yeah.